I initially thought that we might be able to get through this in about an hour, but it's looking like it's going to be much longer.
Sometimes it takes a while to put out a dumpster fire.
It does, and we're running out of buckets.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hi, folks. Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 264. Joining me again this week, the pistol-packing padre himself, John Bennett. Pastor, welcome back.
Back for another round of punishment.
Glutton for punishment.
Yes, we're just masochists, I guess.
I guess so. What the pastor is alluding to, folks, if you weren't here last week for the mind-numbing horribleness, we are continuing to fisk an article from the Holy Kiss blog at pathos.com. We started this last week, episode 263. I would encourage you to go back and listen to that. But before we begin, I want to thank the awesome men and women who make this show possible, the members of the Reformation Gun Club. Armed Lutheran Radio is listener-funded, and that means that we rely on the monthly and yearly contributions of our members. And this week, I want to give a shout-out to Greg from Holly, Michigan, Melvin from Holt, Missouri, Richard from Pagosa Springs, Colorado, Robert from Monroe, Georgia, and Steve from Grovetown, Georgia. Thank you all so much for your support, especially in these crazy economic times. We certainly do appreciate it. As I said, Armed Lutheran Radio is listener-funded, and that means that we rely on our listeners to keep us to keep the lights on. We don't have any sponsors. You won't hear any advertising except for this brief plug. Members get access to hundreds of hours of exclusive content, invitations to our monthly online hangouts, access to our cool new website, and the satisfaction of knowing you made all of this possible. So check out all the benefits and exclusive content available at armedlutheran.us/gun club, or look for a link in the show notes for this or any of our previous episodes. All right. Where did we leave off?
Somewhere in the pits of despair, I believe.
Yes. If you're just joining us, again, if you missed the past few episodes, last week we started critiquing an article by Roger Woolsey, a Methodist minister, quote-unquote minister, director of campus ministry, I believe, at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and a complete brainless lunatic. He blogs over at pathos.com. He wrote this article called America's Needed 1-2 Punch, and he wrote this in the aftermath of the grocery store shooting in Boulder. So if you missed last week, and if we start out and none of this seems to make sense, you'd like a little more context and a little more punishment, go back and listen to episode 263. And then come back and listen to the rest of this craziness.
And we are not responsible if this causes anyone to slip into depression and or alcoholism.
Yes, absolutely. We are indemnified against any potential harm this might do to you. You're listening at your own risk. Last week's listeners have been subjected to the stupid already, so they have herd immunity. So if this is your first time, you might want to go back and listen to 263 just to boost your immune system. So picking up where Roger left off, America is hardly a Christian nation. You mainstream American Christians, evangelicals, he puts in parentheses, statistically tend to support capital punishment and oppose gun control. And you supported the decidedly unnecessary wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Despite what you think about yourselves, you are pro-death. Indeed, many of your church... I just can't do this. We're pro-death. This is rich coming from the guy who depersons unborn children
Yeah.
so that he doesn't have to face up to the fact that he supports infanticide.
Yeah, that's why slavery was allowed in the United States, is because if you were black, you were considered not a person.
Mm-hmm. What's the difference?
Yeah.
I don't see one. Many of your churches hold fundraiser raffles with semi-auto rifles as prizes. Some of your churches even blasphemously bless guns and allow parishioners to pack heat when they come to worship. Again, you suck. Your way leads to hell. Repent.
I think Jesus told his disciples, he that does not have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one.
Oh, wait a minute. In a minute, he says that's hogwash. But yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He says it's hogwash, but he doesn't say why it's hogwash.
No, of course not. Now he includes a picture. He's prolific in his use of links to support his points. But when he talks about blessing guns, he does have a picture, but no link to support that. So there's a picture of a guy in a pastor's garb, robe, and it looks like he's maybe got a collar, and he's sprinkling what we can assume is holy water over a table full of, guess what looks like hunting rifles,
right?
Not semi-auto rifles. So I'm guessing maybe this guy, I don't know for sure, and apparently he doesn't either, but this looks, I haven't seen this many rifles with wooden stocks since the collector's show that I went to, this surplus table that I saw at the last gun show I went to. These look like hunting rifles.
Right. My
guess, if I had to guess here, I'm thinking maybe the pastor is blessing them so the hunters that you see in the background in the photo, perhaps they're hunters, are that they might have success in their hunt. I have no idea. I mean, I've heard of this sort of thing, that maybe they're blessing it so that these people can be successful and provide for their families. Maybe I've heard of, blessing. I think back in the Middle Ages, it was not uncommon to bless livestock so that they would provide for the people of the community, that they would live long and not get horrible diseases and die and leave people starving.
Right.
I don't know, but he doesn't provide us with any real context for this. I have seen like the Moonies do that whole, they all come in with their, and I don't know why he didn't include that one.
Right.
Because that one is, I've seen that, and that's kind of egregiously weird.
What this priest is really doing is he's officially anointing these as ghost guns so the government can't trace them.
That's exactly right. I didn't think about that. Oh my gosh. And he talks about supporting unnecessary wars, and we can debate whether or not it was necessary to go to war in Iraq. But Afghanistan, after 9/11, I mean, I don't know how old Raj is, but does he not remember that 3,000 people were killed when jihadists brought the fight to us on our soil? And then he expects us not to go fight it back?
Based on his arguments, he sounds like he's about 12. But
that's possible.
That's putting the best construction on everything.
But who else opposed foreign wars? Donald Trump. And I bet he doesn't like Trump. But anyway, so this idea that that a church can't raffle off a firearm to raise money assumes that guns by their very nature are, and we've talked about this before, that somehow there's some evil talisman, that they are inherently evil, as opposed to the evil of the person who uses them.
Right.
Weird. Some of your churches blasphemously bless guns and allow parishioners to pack heat. So you brought up and he says here at the end of this paragraph, he says, you are completely rejecting the way, teaching, and example of Jesus. You are people of fear, not faith, and don't even try me with that. But Jesus said, get swords, hogwash. You want to answer that hogwash, Pastor?
Well, it's only hogwash if you reject the plenary verbal inspiration of Scripture and only want to accept as God's truth those things that you like.
Right.
And here's, yeah, we've rehashed Luke 22 time and time again, but yeah, this guy,
yeah,
and being a pastor, air quotes, in the United Methodist Church, they reject the inspiration of Scripture anyway. So
Jesus didn't told his disciples to sell their cloaks and go out and buy swords. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to go out and buy a gun.
Right.
But it also doesn't mean that we're prohibited from doing it as a Christian.
It wasn't like Jesus was speaking in code saying, now you can only have knives that are of this certain length of a blade, and you can only have X number of knives, and you have to do a background check, and you can only own so many of them.
Yep.
Jesus must have been speaking in code.
Clearly. And he complains about the church's blessing guns, but wonder what he thinks about his own church that went out and blessed abortion clinics.
Yes, I was just going to say that. Yeah.
I'm going to guess he's probably never written a single line about how blasphemous that is.
No.
Especially since unborn children aren't people. The idea of the packing heat in church, as he calls it. Pastor, can you cite for me a verse? I'm sure it's in there somewhere, where Jesus admonishes his followers to disarm themselves and not to carry swords in the temple.
It's in Hezekiah 32, I think.
That's what I thought. That's exactly what I was thinking. That's our favorite source for Jesus's position on guns is Hezekiah. Little known. Go look it up. Ever since the Cleveland elementary school shooting in 1979, a female shooter, I don't know why he bothered to put a female shooter in parentheses at the end of that, as though that makes any difference.
It's misogynist.
I guess. And the Columbine High School shooting in 1999, our nation has done nothing, in capital letters, substantial to meaningfully reduce the number of mass shootings that take place in public places. Yeah. President Trump did the least he could do, enacting a ban on bump stocks after Las Vegas. And a few states have passed laws limiting the size of magazine clips that can be used in semi-automatic rifles, but that's about it.
Yeah, real quick, just to rehash this, because we've talked about this before. The Columbine High School shooting happened during Clinton's assault rifle ban or assault weapon ban. It banned magazine size. It banned guns that looked scary. And guess what? Crime during that era was on the increase, including the Columbine High School shooting. So this guy saying that we've done, quote unquote, nothing. Well, something, quote unquote, substantial was done back in 1994, but he seems to have completely forgotten that.
And it didn't help.
It did nothing.
And it was right there
Absolutely
in his own home state of Colorado. And guess what else was in effect at the time that Columbine happened? The Gun-Free Schools Act of 1990, followed by the Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994, which put some teeth into the 1990 Act, which basically told schools, hey, if you're not gun-free and if you don't have a zero tolerance policy, you're not going to get any federal funding.
Yeah.
And yet, the AWB, the assault weapons ban, it sunset in 2000. Those two gun control acts, or the gun-free zone acts, are still in force. And they've done nothing to reduce school shootings, mass shootings in schools.
Yep. 96% of quote-unquote mass shootings happen in gun-free zones.
Yep. And the Boulder shooting that he is writing this in response to, the grocery store shooting, it happens, that's right there in Colorado, which he should know has a ban on high-capacity magazines and so-called assault rifles, if I'm not mistaken. And it still didn't do anything to stop the shooting.
Not a darn thing.
The common denominator, he says, in most all of these mass shootings is semi-automatic rifles, most frequently the AR-15, a weapon that was designed for the U.S. military and whose designer didn't want in civilian hands.
And he links to an article where it's just a family claiming that.
Yeah. So there's 2 points about that. Eugene Stoner's family claimed at some point that, oh, hey, Eugene didn't want civilians to own the AR-15, even though the AR-15 has been available to civilians almost since it was created.
Right.
Semi-auto variants you could go and buy at the hardware store.
Without a background check.
With no background check.
You could order them and have them arrive in the mail at your home.
Exactly. I've seen. Have you seen the magazine, the newspaper ads that with the beautiful ads with the pictures of the AR-15 with that old, the triangular plastic foregrip?
Yep.
That you could have this shipped to your house for whatever, I don't remember. It was
$129.95 or something like that. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly. And so whether Eugene Stoner wanted that or not, it doesn't. First off, who cares what Eugene Stoner thought? He wasn't one of the founders. He didn't write the Constitution.
Now, if it was John Moses Browning, maybe I might take what he had to say, Not just kidding.
Yeah. Stoner's up there, though. I would, but again, like you said, this article that he links to is not Stoner himself saying it. This is his family claiming it.
Right.
Which I suspect is them sort of trying to virtue signal and keep the heat off of them, right? Hey, don't blame us. Yeah, Dad created the AR-15, but he didn't want people to actually own it.
Yeah.
So I suspect there's a little of that going on. In truth, many mainstream Christians consider the school kids and other citizens. This is where things get really despicable. Many American mainstream Christians consider the school kids and other citizens who die in mass shootings to be acceptable losses, to maintain their loyalty to their idolatrous devotion and commitment to their interpretation of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
That is the most despicable thing that he says, and I think in this whole article, the suggestion that, and again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If you don't agree with him on gun control, then you don't care whether people die.
Right. Yeah, that we're okay with children dying as long as we get to keep our guns is what he's arguing.
Right. And later in the article, he talks about, here's some ideas for how to start a dialogue. I don't know how you start a dialogue when you start out by suggesting that the people who disagree with you don't care about kids being killed. Right. I, for one, don't really want to have a conversation with anybody who makes that argument. I don't want to talk to Roger about gun rights or anyone like him if they suggest that if they're going to make that claim and suggest that, well, you just don't care about kids getting killed, screw you, Roger. I don't want to talk to you anymore.
Yeah.
There's no way to have a constructive and productive conversation with people who think this way.
No, the sinner in me wants to pay for a hunting trip with Dick Cheney for this guy.
Or at the very least, a good solid throat punch.
Yes.
The second, and here he's going to echo President Biden-Harris, the Second Amendment is neither an inalienable nor a God-given right. Not even according to our nation's charter documents. You don't have the liberty to own a nuclear weapon or a Stinger missile. God, I hate this argument. It is so stupid. And you don't have a sacred right to own a military/combat grade, that's a new term, semi-automatic firearm. Okay.
If it was combat grade, it would be fully automatic.
I started to say, if it's exactly.
Here's the stupidity with this argument. At the time that the Second Amendment was ratified, just about every single man, and you could include most boys over the age of 14, had access to quote unquote military combat grade weapons, because the weapons that they had for their personal use were the same weapons they used in the Revolutionary War.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about this on the show what episode, the one where we responded to Biden Harris's Dog and Pony show on gun control.
Yeah.
About how at the time of the founding, you had private citizens owning cannons and warships.
Right.
And the Constitution was written, and it didn't say your right to bear arms is shall not be infringed unless we're talking about cannons and warships. They didn't. Yeah. Right? There were no exclusions. And I absolutely hate this argument. This you don't have a right to own a nuclear weapon. Nobody's talking about nuclear weapons. We're talking about handguns and rifles that are in common use. Right? And the common use thing is something that the Supreme Court has there's a phrase that the Supreme Court has used repeatedly to talk about arms that are in common use. Nuclear weapons are not in common use. Semi-automatic rifles are very much in common use. Millions and millions of them are owned by law-abiding citizens in this country. Now, his argument about the Second Amendment and it not being inalienable and not God-given, that's a kind of a verbal sleight of hand, I think, because, yeah, the Second Amendment is not God-given, but the inalienable rights that the Constitution talks about are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so the Bill of Rights was intended to codify the protection of those things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, primarily from government tyranny.
Right.
So
absolutely.
The First Amendment was to protect your right to the liberty to speak, even if you speak heresy like this goofball. The Second Amendment protects your life and all your other rights from both the tyranny of government and from criminals who would abuse their rights to deny you yours. So it's like I said, it's kind of a sleight of hand. You could, the Second Amendment wasn't God-given in that God didn't, there's nowhere we can say that God actually says, yes, own a firearm. But at the same time, he also didn't say don't own slaves. He also didn't say you have a right to a fair trial. He also didn't say, right? He says God gave us life. God and Jesus, to use his terms. Again, I love that. I'm going to keep doing that. They gave us our life, and we have a responsibility to protect it. And the Second Amendment is how we protect those liberties that God has given us. So it's an indirect way. When we say it's God-given, we're not saying God gave us guns. We're saying God gave us a right to life, and we have a right to protect that life. And guns are one way to do it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so enough with that dumb nuclear missile argument. It troubles me that someone came from outside of Boulder to cause havoc to the Boulder community. It would also trouble me if someone within the Boulder community caused the trouble. What troubles me more is that anyone from any location has easy access to semi-automatic rifles in this country. And then he talks about how the NRA had posted a tweet about their celebrating muscling the Colorado legislature into enacting preemption laws, basically so that cities in Colorado can't come out and ban guns, so that the state's laws have to apply equally. And he says, this is deplorable. The NRA is anti-Christ, and so are those who support them and are beholden to them. Again, you suck. Your way leads to hell. Repent. So my response to that, what would your response to that be? The NRA is anti-Christ, and anybody who supports them is going to hell.
Well, he's making this all based off of the existence of the AR-15 and the availability to the average law-abiding citizen of the AR-15. So I would say he's got to start looking at banning knives and fists and feet, which kill more people than AR-15s. So,
yep, exactly.
Yeah. And last time I checked, the NRA and the amount that they contribute to congressional candidates is a fraction of a percent compared to what Planned Parenthood does in supporting their candidates.
In order to perpetuate the killing of the unborn.
Yes. Yes.
Yep.
No one's ever walked into the NRA and died, but many have died at the hands of Planned Parenthood.
And how many of the mass shooters that he's talking about were NRA members?
Yes.
How many of them were disaffected liberals? How many of them were jihadists? How many of them were just straight up nutcases?
Yeah. Yeah.
The problem isn't the NRA. The problem, there's a different problem in this country. And like you were pointing out, most of these happen in gun-free zones, despite the Gun-Free Zones Act of 1990 and 1994. And don't try me with most gun violence in America are homicides, many committed by black young men against other black men. Yes, we're never going to be able to prevent all murders, but we really can do something about reducing the number and lethality of mass shootings. This is the thing that you and I have talked about over and over. Why this focus? Why are they so stuck on the idea of mass shootings when, as we point out time and time again, so many more people are dying in just everyday, regular street violence in our inner cities? We talked about the percentages in previous shows, so we don't have to rehash them here. We did it a little bit earlier. But why the preoccupation with mass shootings and not with stopping the violence that we see, the more common violence that we see?
Honestly, I think it's just because of political expediency. It's plain to any reasonably thinking person who hasn't lost their mind and become a liberal that the purpose behind all of this, at least from the politician's perspective, is that if they can take the guns out of the hands of the people, you can control the people. But all this focus on mass shootings, it is such a tiny percent of the number of firearm-related homicides annually. But they focus upon that because it has the most emotional appeal to the general public.
At a minimum, we need to re-implement the assault weapons ban that our nation had in place for 10 years. Blah.
Did nothing.
In favor of did nothing. I'm in favor of expanding the ban to include, get this, all semi-automatic rifles and combat-grade pistols, such as the Ruger AR-556, including those used by hunters. Now, point to me a single place on Earth, a single military that uses AR pistols with arm braces in their militaries.
There are no militaries that even use the AR-15.
No, exactly. The full size. Yeah. There's no real difference aside from, and he points out, there's no real difference aside from how they look.
Oh, gosh.
Irony much? That's the problem. When you get right down to it, and you've said it before, it's the scary looking guns that they don't like. It's what they look like, because it looks like a military weapon. Oh my goodness, that's bad. They don't care that it's just like the .22 rifle that I used as a kid.
Right. Right. Would you want to go hunting for a hog with a bolt-action rifle?
Oh, hell no. No.
Those mean nasty buggers, it can take 2-3 rounds sometimes before you take them down. And those hogs tend to kill human beings if those human beings aren't able to defend themselves.
Yep. Australia and New Zealand are among the many nations that have bans on semi-automatic rifles, and their hunters do just fine with lever-action or bolt-action rifles.
And there are more guns now in Australia than there was before their ban.
Yes.
And their crime rate did not decrease.
No. The violent crime rate went up, and I've seen numerous videos and news reports about finding homemade guns. So all they've done is taken guns away from people who weren't really going to cause a problem in the first place. The people who really do want to cause a problem, they'll find a way to cause a problem. And to be frank, I don't give a crap what Australia did. I don't care what Australians and New Zealanders think or what the Brits think of our gun laws. Newsflash, the founders weren't really caring about an uprising of deer. The Second Amendment has nothing to do with hunting. What they were concerned about, subsequent to the founding, they were concerned about uprisings of black folks. And so then you had gun control laws to keep guns out of the hands of the people that, you can't keep the black folks down if you allow them to have guns. So that's where a lot of our gun laws come from. It's like Maj Touré says, all gun control is racist because its origins come from the black codes. Let's be clear. The shooting in Boulder wasn't the second instance in the past week. Most folks think of Atlanta, but there have been 7 mass shootings in the U.S. over the past 7 days. The COVID pandemic is waning, and we're tragically returning to our old normal, a dysfunctional normal of nearly 1 mass shooting every day of the year in the U.S. Now, we won't spend a whole lot of time on that, but that's a horrible lie that Mother Jones and the Gun Violence Archive came up with, that basically they changed the definition of mass shooting to only consider the number of victims.
Right.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's some stranger killing people like in Parkland or in Las Vegas, or whether it's a guy killing his family in a murder-suicide, or whether it's a gang shootout or a drive-by shooting. Those are all classified as quote-unquote mass shootings, and that's not. Those aren't mass shootings.
And this guy, the article that he includes about there being 7 mass shootings in the last 7 days, it happens to include a drive-by shooting.
Of course, yeah. It's like back when we were talking. I guess it was right after Parkland. They were talking about the frequency of school shootings. Remember Every Town for Gun Safety?
Yes.
They've trotted out these numbers that suggested how crazy frequent school shootings were. And it was the same Gun Violence Archive that they were referring to. And what they were doing was they were classifying any shooting that happened on school property or near it was counted as a school shooting, like Parkland.
Right.
So
even if no children were remotely involved in anything.
Yes. When there's a shooting across the street and the bullet hit the side of the building, that was counted as a school shooting. A school resource officer accidentally discharges his firearm on school property. Nobody gets hurt. That's a school shooting. Black folks showing up in the parking lot at night for whoever, it didn't have to be black folks, but anybody showing up after dark, after school is out and a drug deal goes bad and there's a shooting, that's a school shooting, the same way that Newtown was a school shooting. And that is a complete, the only reason for that is to try to fudge the numbers to make it sound worse than it really is.
Right.
It's just like counting suicides in the firearm homicide numbers and suggesting that 38,000 people every year die from gun violence.
Yeah, it would be like saying I have, 25 wives, because I've now changed the definition of wife to include friends who happen to be married to somebody else. I mean, they are a wife. They're somebody's wife, and they're a friend of mine. Wife. So, well.
Why not?
Yeah. But that's what they've done. They changed the definition to jack up the rates.
Yep. It's all driven by the agenda. And again, there's no way to solve the problem if we can't get our head around the problem. And if we're inflating the numbers artificially just to push a narrative, you can't solve a problem if you don't know the scope of it. Like, how bad is this problem? Well, if you inflate it so much that it includes things that aren't actually problems, like adding in the school resource officer and his stupidity, that's you can't get a hold of the real problem if you're doing that, because that just dilutes things and it doesn't make any sense anymore. It's not possible to solve those problems doing that. He's going to panic about the number of guns that were sold in the last year without exactly explaining why so many guns were sold in the last year. When the COVID pandemic hit last year, many Americans responded with another pandemic, a weapons buying binge. Yes, that's a pandemic. And more weapons led to more deaths. Did they? I don't think that's true, is it? 3 million more guns, he quotes, I'm not sure what this article is, but he quotes somebody, 3 million more guns sold between March and June than predicted by past averages. That would have been March and June of 2020. Surging again after summer protests against police violence. So the article that he cites actually tells you why people are buying guns.
It's because they're afraid of these nut jobs that are getting violent.
Right. But Raj here can't acknowledge that. He's focused on, oh my gosh, people are buying guns. In October alone, 2 million guns were sold, a 67% increase over 2019, according to the FBI. Then it goes on a little bit more. By November, the total number of gun homicides in 2020 had exceeded the year-end total for each of the past 4 years. Mass shootings, I don't know. Obviously, it was because so many people were legally buying guns.
Yeah, must be all those people filling out those 44. I can't even think of the term now. My whiskey's getting to me.
4473.
Yes, must have been all those people filling out the form 4473. Yeah, and there is a direct correlation between the increase in homicide in metropolitan areas and police taking a step back because they're sick and tired of being treated like trash.
Exactly. The simple explanation for the gun buying binge in 2020 and for the rise of homicides, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, Antifa, and the defund police movement.
Yep.
So you have basically people running wild, burning cities down. You have the Antifa freaks taking over entire city blocks and attacking federal buildings and police and burning down police departments and federal buildings, and police doing nothing about it and being told to step back and let people do whatever. And because of COVID, remember we talked about this in our COVID Palooza episodes. You had police departments who were literally announcing they weren't going to come out on 911 calls unless it was really bad.
Right.
And they're letting people out of jail. They're making no bones about letting prisoners and violent felons out of jail. Remember the mayor of New York who was shocked that they would go out and commit crime after being let out of jail after the mayor was so nice to them. Why would they betray him by going out and committing crime? What? Who would have thought? That's why people are buying guns. Now, if you want to find out, my question would be, instead of trying to conflate the number of legal gun purchases with the rise in gun homicide, tell me how many of those millions of new gun purchases actually were used in those to perpetrate that increase in crime. Yeah. It has nothing to do with the new gun purchases. The people were buying guns to protect themselves from that crap.
Exactly.
Clearly, what's needed are sensible gun control regulations, and most Americans are in favor of increased regulations. Here are some thoughts I offer to help get a needed conversation going. Now, before we jump into his thoughts, his claim that most Americans are in favor of increased regulations, there's new polling data that suggests that that is not true at all.
Correct.
Have you seen this? I saw this poll, I think, that support for increased gun regulation among young people between 19 and 35 has actually dropped 20 points.
Wow.
So young people are able to, they're seeing past all the rhetoric, and they're looking outside and saying, wait a minute, there's criminals being let go and the police are being defunded, and they're stepping back and letting rioters do whatever they want. And yet the government is saying, you don't need a gun. I want a gun. So it doesn't seem to be working out as Roger seems to think. So here's his helpful thoughts to get a needed conversation going. And this, I don't know why Roger thinks this will help. All law-abiding, responsible, mentally sound gun owners are law-abiding, responsible, and mentally sound until the days that they aren't.
That would be like saying every man's a rapist until he isn't. Or, I'm sorry, I said that completely backwards. Every man is not a rapist until he is.
Yeah, and wasn't it the University of Colorado at Boulder where they actually, it was some years ago, where they actually put up a billboard with pictures of members of the male members of the student body saying, these are potential rapists. Yeah. And so that's exactly what the left thinks. You are a criminal in waiting. It's like what is it? What was that book? Minority Report?
Yes. That was also a Tom Cruise movie that was, depending on your opinion, it could have been a great movie or it could have been terrible because it had Tom Cruise in it.
Right. So I have not seen the movie. I have got a copy of the book. So I think I'll read that instead. Fellow Americans, Roger says, look, the current official interpretation of the Second Amendment is not as sacred as you or the lives of your loved ones and fellow citizens.
So being deprived of the ability to defend your life or the life of others is less sacred than the lives of your loved ones and fellow citizens.
Yes.
But then again, this guy believes that a baby isn't a baby until it's born, so.
Right. There were nearly as many mass shootings in 2019 as there were days that year, and he made that claim. That's just bogus. This cannot be our normal. I invite us to think further about gun control. It seems many hear that term and assume an all or nothing situation. Not at all. Nations such as Australia and others still allow hunters to have firearms designed for hunting. However, they got rid of most all other forms of firearms via a national gun buyback program.
Incorrect. Incorrect. According to estimates, there are more firearms now in Australia than there was before their gun buyback.
Yeah. Yeah. And the buyback did nothing to stop violent crime. The violent crime numbers went up in the immediate aftermath of the buyback. So there's two problems with this. One is this idea that the government allows us to have firearms, or should allow us to have firearms for hunting. Remember, I don't know whether you watched President Biden Harris's creepy, crazy State of the Union thing the other night.
I'm a masochist, but not that much of a masochist.
No, I did. I watched sort of the recaps because that's all I could handle. I knew I would probably throw something at the screen if I watched, and I was right. I joked that, if I had played drink every time Biden lies, if I'd watched and then done that, it would have been a pretty awesome night, or I would have died of of alcohol poisoning, one or the other. But he made this weird comment about how there's absolutely no justification for someone to own to have a 100 or a 100 round magazine or 100 rounds to go in your firearm. And then he went off script and said something goofy, wandered off of talking about deer with Kevlar vests. And this is the same stupid mentality. The Second Amendment has nothing to do with hunting. It was because they knew that the citizen needed the ability to protect themselves against government tyranny. It has nothing to do with hunting. Absolutely nothing. And yet, that's exactly what the left keeps spouting.
Right. And now, according to this guy, semi-automatic firearms are quote-unquote combat-grade weapons.
Right. That's the new term, combat grade. Now, the other problem with this the idea of a national buyback is the idea that you bought the guns from the government somehow in the first place. So you can't actually sell something back to the government that didn't belong to the government to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So
well, and let's be honest. If the government had to fill out a Form 4473, they would be a prohibited person for the straw purchases that happened under the Obama administration.
Well, Biden's own son is
Yes.
a prohibited person, so... yeah. So the idea that, and this is sort of, this comes from the same idea that government you mentioned it last time we were together. They have replaced God with government. And so government is the thing that bequeaths us all of our liberties and our, all the good things in life. All that comes from government, not from God, but from government.
Right.
And
I wouldn't say liberties, I would say permissions, because that's how they treat it.
Good point. Yes, exactly right. Yep. All right, folks, I'm going to have to wrap it up here. We're going to have to take another break here in the middle of this episode because, like I said last week, we haven't done this in a while. So when I scheduled this article, when I said, hey, we should cover this article, I figured it would take about as long as it had in the past. Generally, it took 45 minutes to an hour for us to do a good fisking of an article. This one is chocked full of so much crazy that it's got to be 3 shows, or it would be 1 3-hour show. So, episode 265 next week, we'll be getting into some of Roger's specific proposals for reducing mass violence, and we'll wrap a bow on this box of turds and finish it all up. Until we meet again to finish all this out, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback, or a review on iTunes, and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a member of the Self-Defense Radio Network.